Welcome everybody again to the second presentation on cosmology and Christ. I'm going to go straight to the slides and allow the slides to guide both you and me through the presentation. So welcome again to the second presentation. It fits in after the first one, an introduction to our worldview. And in this presentation, I want to give the essential background to how Colossians and Ephesians would have been understood at the time of writing. That means exploring their worldview. And this is an essential step before we begin reading the actual texts themselves. So we're going to have an introduction, something on Lady Wisdom, something on the origin of the doctrine of the resurrection. We spend a bit of time with Stoicism, and we're going to look at one particular philosopher, Philo of Alexandria, the emergence of early Christ devotion, and then, as usual, questions for reflection, a task, and a preview of the next step. So again, as we are aware from the last presentation, faith and reason do belong together in the Catholic type churches, so Anglican, Orthodox, Roman. Faith, of course, is not to be reduced to reason, but they are not incompatible. And in this presentation, we look at the big background to the affirmation about Christ in Colossians and Ephesians. And that will take us, as foreseen, to the wisdom traditions, the emergence of belief in the resurrection, something on Stoicism, Philo of Alexandria, Jewish philosopher, and early Christ devotion. Of course, all religions, in some way or other, have to deal with the nearness of God and the beyond of God. Usually religions want to hold both. And technically, the nearness is called the immanence of God, and the beyond of God is called his transcendence. Now, in philosophically oriented cultures, this will happen in books of philosophy and theology. But ancient Israelite faith was not particularly philosophical in outlook or in language, and instead they used poetry and imagery in order to negotiate the sense of God's presence in all that is, and still that God was greater than all that is. And the best example in the biblical tradition is the wisdom books, and in particular, the metaphorical figure of Lady Wisdom. And it's very commonly recognized that Dame Wisdom, Lady Wisdom, is one essential part of the background for reading the hymn and the blessing in Colossians and Ephesians. Where do we find this personification of wisdom? Well, a number of places. In Job 28, a very beautiful poem where wisdom is not quite personified, but elusive and sought, so important. Very particularly in Proverbs 1-9, especially in Proverbs chapter 8, there's a very clear personification of Lady Wisdom. Sirach 4:24 continues that, where it almost speaks of incarnation. In Baruch chapter 3, wisdom is embodied in the Torah. Perhaps the highest realization of this whole tradition is to be found in the book of Wisdom, chapter 7, verse 7 to 9:18. And in 7:22b to 8:1, the highest personification of wisdom in ancient Jewish books. We'll take a quick look at these relatively familiar texts. In Proverbs 8, for example, we read, "The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soil." So this is wisdom talking about her coming out from God, her being created before any creation at all had taken place. It's slightly unclear whether she is part of creation or still part of the divine emanation into creation. In the book of Sirach, this is taken further with a special reference to wisdom coming to reside among the people of Israel. Again, wisdom is praising herself. Wisdom praises herself and tells of her glory in the midst of her people. In the assembly of the Most High, she opens her mouth, and the presence of his host, she tells of her glory. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist. I dwelt in the highest heavens, and my throne was in a pillar of cloud. Alone I compassed the vault of heaven and traversed the depths of the abyss. Over waves of the sea, and over all the earth, and over every people and nation, I have held sway. Among all these, I sought a resting place. In whose territory should I abide? Then the Creator of all things gave me a command, and my Creator chose a place for my tent. He said, make your dwelling in Jacob, and in Israel receive your inheritance. Before the ages, in the beginning, he created me, and for all ages I shall not cease to be. Already you will have felt when listening to this the connections with the prologue of John's Gospel, John 1:1-18, but it's also part of the background to the hymn and the blessing in Colossians and Ephesians. The highest realization of this tradition is to be found in the Greek Book of Wisdom. There are two parts here, as you can see. In 7:22b-23, there's an extraordinary list of the qualities that belong to Lady Wisdom. There is in her a spirit that is intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, clear, mobile, unpolluted, distinct, invulnerable, loving the good, keen, irresistible, beneficent, humane, steadfast, sure, free from anxiety, all-powerful, overseeing all, and penetrating through all things that are intelligent, pure, and altogether subtle. It has not been lost to experts to notice that there are 21 attributes, that is 7 by 3, so perfect by perfect, the complete summation of the characteristics of Lady Wisdom. And the writer goes on to use some extraordinary images for this figure of Lady Wisdom. It begins with a general sentence, for wisdom is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things. Now, the 5 images are key. She is a breath of the power of the Most High, a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore, nothing defiled gains entrance into her, for she is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. In this way, ancient Israelites were able to say, God is present in all that is, without reducing God to all that is. So this teaching captures the transcendence and the immanence, the beyond of God and the nearness of God. So in summary, in 3 moments, wisdom has a divine origin. She existed before creation and had a role in creation, just like Christ in the Colossian hymn. Wisdom is identified with the divine spirit and is immanent, present in the world. Furthermore, wisdom grounds the coherence and permanence of the cosmos, very like what's in Colossians, he holds all things in being. Wisdom has a special mission to human beings, revelation and blessing. And wisdom is part of Israel, God's presence, the Shekinah, God's teaching, the Torah, and God's presence in salvation history. And finally, as in all the wisdom traditions, wisdom is a gift which calls for discipline. And wisdom is specifically personified as a woman as complementary, in the sense that just as a man is complemented by a woman, the human being is complemented by wisdom. The second background is resurrection language for understanding what's claimed in the Colossian hymn and in the Ephesian blessing. And to understand this, it is important to remember that resurrection language is a late arrival in the Bible. The particular context for this was religious persecution under a Syrian ruler called Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the middle of the 2nd century BC. He put to death people who would not give up their faith, so he triggered martyrdom. And for the Jews who were watching this, a theological question arose. Is God faithful to those who've been faithful to him to the point of death? And they expanded their religious understanding of life after death to include resurrection so that God could be seen as faithful. This comes out in Daniel 12, 1-3 in Hebrew, 2 Maccabees 7 in Greek, and Isaiah 26 also in Hebrew. In this context, it's important to remember that resurrection is not resuscitation or immortality of soul. Rather, resurrection is God's restoration of the faithful when history is over. It is therefore transhistorical and in some sense, by implication, also cosmic. After Jesus' death, the early Christians used different metaphors to express what happens to Jesus in his death. For instance, they used the clearly metaphorical, he sat at the right hand of God. They also said he ascended, was exalted and glorified, and they also said resurrected. Now, resurrection was different because it didn't simply mean that Jesus went to a transcendent realm. Instead, resurrection is personal, so he was resurrected. Communal is the future of all humanity and is what God will do at the end of time. And in the religious view of the period, end time implies beginning as well. And this is clearly seen, for instance, in 2 Corinthians 4:6, where Jesus' resurrection is connected to creation. In 2 Corinthians 4:6 we read, for God who said, let light shine out of darkness, is the one who shined in our hearts to give us the light of the glorious knowledge of God in the face of Christ. Now, the clearest connecting of the beginning and the end is found in St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. And as a faithful Jew, St. Paul affirms the resurrection as end time. But he joins the end time very explicitly with the beginning. So in Paul's worldview, there is a second Adam, and there was also a first Adam, Jesus and Adam. And in the mindset of the time, the congruity, the matching of the two Adams signals an overall divine purpose. And the incongruity, that the imbalance of grace, signals God's divine grace in the second Adam. We can see this very clearly in two parts of 1 Corinthians 15, both of which I'll simply read. But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead also came through a man. For just as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive, but each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, then when Christ comes, those who belong to him. And the second passage that's of interest is further on in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 42 onwards, where there's an explicit related comparison and contrast. It is the same with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, and it's raised a spiritual body. A new term invented by St. Paul. If there is a spiritual body, if there is a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. So also it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living person. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual did not come first, but the natural and then the spiritual. The first man is from the earth made of dust. The second man is from heaven. Like the one made of dust, so too are those made of dust. And like the one from heaven, so too those who are heavenly. And just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, let us also bear the image of the man of heaven. It's very interesting how St. Paul connects resurrection with the end of time and with the beginning of time. Another context of the period, a broader context, is the popular philosophies. At that time, certain philosophies were genuinely popular and could be encountered in the marketplace and the homes and in the schools. In particular, three stood out: Cynicism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism. And our focus is going to be on Stoicism. And scholars divide Stoicism into three periods: early, middle, and late. So middle is about 150 BC to AD 50. Topics of the Stoics were logic, physics, and ethics, and our interest is in their cosmology. In a general Stoic worldview, the universe is a unified material being, a continuum with active and passive aspects. Then they said passive matter is informed by an immanent active structuring principle called logos, which means word, that gives shape to any given instance of matter. From the word logos, of course, comes our word logic. So the logic of all that is comes from the logos that is immanent in everything. In the Stoic worldview, fire was said to be the preeminent element inasmuch as it is ultimately constitutive of others, and alone cannot be resolved into something else. It was associated closely with both logos, word, and pneuma, breath or spirit or wind. And in particular, the Stoics identified God variously as one, the active principle, whether logos or fire, immanent in all that is, that gives structure and purpose to the universe. Very like what's said of Christ in the Colossian hymn. Or they identified God as the nature of the world itself, pictured rather like a human being, as a living body governed by reason, the world being the body and the reason being the divine presence. And they thought human beings had a special kinship with God as a result of their own rational nature. That language of logos, pneuma, structure, purpose, holding everything together, that's part of how the Colossian hymn would have been heard by its first hearers. Stoicism also comes up a little bit in the Bible. In Acts 17, St. Paul on the Areopagus. In Wisdom, of course, the book of Wisdom. In John, it's behind, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and in the Colossian hymn. A very interesting example of somebody bringing philosophy and religion together is Philo of Alexandria. And we'll take a quick look at Philo here. Philo was a 1st century AD Jewish biblical exegete, biblical scholar, and thinker. And his particular gift was to bring together the biblical tradition and Greek philosophy. He was born around 30 BC and died around AD 50. Thus he was a contemporary of two Jews of the period, Jesus and Hillel. His family was important. A brother was Alexander the Alabarch, who was extremely wealthy, and one of his sons, Tiberius Julius Alexander, abandoned his ancestral faith and served in several high positions under the Romans. So we can take consolation that so great a Jew as Philo of Alexandria himself did not succeed in handing on his faith to some of his children at least. And Philo himself was profoundly loyal to the Jewish scriptures, religion, and people. And one of the wonderful things about Philo is a vast number of his works survive and can be inspected and read. He was thoroughly familiar with Greek philosophy, learning, and culture. Now, Philo of Alexandria applied the concept of divine logos, which he really got from the Bible and from Greek philosophy, to God's creation and the ordering of the world. Now, the language here will strike us as very close to what's going on in Colossians. According to Philo, logos is the glue and chain that holds all things together, the agency by which God created the world, the receiving of light from light, the origin of human reason, the angelic communication of the divine image to human beings, and then, even more importantly, the firstborn among the created beings, a peacemaking mediator between worlds created and uncreated. So very close to Colossians here. As reference to God in Scripture, when God or theos is used without the article, although logos should not be referred to as God, he still thought of the logos as something coming out from God. Only through the divinely imparted logos is humanity drawn to God. So something of God has come out, is in the human reason and heart, and draws the human being back to God, and that is logos, the word, the logic holding everything together. Finally, there's quite a bit of study has taken place on the early emergence of Christ devotion. That's to say, addressing Christ in prayer in the same way as you would address God. And it turns out that devotion to Christ as to God is part of the very earliest stratum of the Christian tradition. This has been exhaustively researched by an American scholar called Larry Hurtado. It is something of a surprise, because usually people think that the devotion to Christ as God is a late idea in early Christianity, a kind of fruit of evolution. But that's not true. In fact, it's there right from the very beginning. And then curiously, it did not interfere with belief that there was only one God. And it definitely predates Paul, the first Christian writer to survive, who inherits both devotion and texts which deal with devotion. And there are traces of that in Paul's writing. When he uses a word like Maranatha, our Lord come, then he's using some of the Christ devotion language which predates him in Aramaic. And the clearest example of hymn material is Philippians 2, 6-11, though he was in the form of God. So this is doing a much too quick overview of what the background would be to the material in Colossians and Ephesians, and a kind of introduction to how people would have heard these texts. So it involves a rich combination of wisdom traditions, lady wisdom, resurrection having to do with the end of time and the beginning of time, Stoicism to do with the logic, the logos of all things. Philo of Alexandria uses language very close to our language in Colossians, and the early emergence of Christ devotion. Could such apparently disparate traditions, the ones I just mentioned there, come together in any way? And curiously, there's evidence in the Enoch traditions. These are relatively unknown, but are significant. The second one I'll show you is particularly interesting. For instance, in 2nd Enoch, this is an apocalyptic religious text ascribed to Enoch, the great grandfather of Noah. In the traditional way, these things are ascribed to somebody famous. It survives as the Slavonic apocalypse of Enoch. It's closely linked to 1 Enoch and probably translated from the Greek. It's unlikely to be a Christian work and dates from the late 1st century AD. Here's one example. This is the use of angelic figures to talk about the order of all things, what holds everything together. So I'll read the passage starting on 2 Enoch 19:1. And I saw there 7 angels grouped together, brilliant and very glorious. These ones regulate. They study the peaceful order of the stars and the birth of the sun and the moon. And they are the leaders of the angels of celestial speech, and they make all celestial life peaceful, and they preserve the commandments and instructions, and sweet voices and singing, and every kind of praise and glory. And there are angels over seasons and years, and there are also angels over rivers and oceans, angels over fruit and grass and everything that breathes, and angels of all people, and all their life they organize and write it down before the face of the Lord. You can see what's happening here. Angelic figures are used the way the figure of wisdom was used to negotiate the presence of God in all that is, that's to say his nearness, without losing sight of his transcendence or his beyond. The second reading from 1 Enoch is even more powerful. Again, this is an apocalyptic text ascribed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah. It offers a prophetic exposition of the 1,000-year reign of the Messiah. Now, there are older sections, mainly the Book of the Watchers, estimated to come from about 300 to 200 BC, and the latest part, the Book of Power, is about 100 BC. So this text is available at the time of writing. And here's an extraordinary passage from it. In 1 Enoch 48:2, we read as follows. At that hour, that Son of Man was given a name in the presence of the Lord of the spirits, the before time, even before the creation of the sun and the moon, before the creation of the stars, he was given a name in the presence of the Lord of the spirits. He will become a staff for the righteous ones in order that they may lean on him and not fall. He is the light of the Gentiles, and he will become the hope of those who are sick in their hearts. All who dwell upon the earth shall fall down and worship before him. They shall glorify, bless, and sing the name of the Lord of the spirits. For this purpose he became the chosen one. He was concealed in the presence of the Lord of the spirits prior to the creation of the world and for all eternity. An extraordinary text which gives a powerful background for understanding the imagery used of Christ in the Colossians hymn and in the prayer of blessing at the beginning of Ephesians. And so, we're trying to look around at the language and thought world of Colossians and Ephesians, and we find there wisdom traditions, resurrection, Stoicism, Philo of Alexandria is a particular example, and early Christ devotion. And just to notice that our texts, which combine these different speculations, do not come from nowhere. We find something very similar in 1 and 2 Enoch. And of course, definitely in the background, there is also something Pauline as well. So, some questions for reflection. We have our worldview, as we saw in presentation 1. This was an attempt to portray the worldview of first century believers. So a very different worldview, some of it, of course, unfamiliar. So 3 questions for review. How much of this did you know already? How much was new? Was anything in particular that you found exciting or thrilling in this presentation? A task following on that would be to read and meditate on Colossians 1:15 to 20, and take your time, don't rush it. And then, when it seems ready, to read all of Colossians. And if you do that in that order, you might notice how 1:15 to 20 is programmatic and foundational for the letter. It kind of guides the rest of the thinking and teaching across the whole letter. Our next step will be an introduction to Colossians, dealing with authorship, context, and layout. Thanks very much for your patience. I look forward to being with you for the next presentation. So thank you very much, and I hope all that hasn't been too much, and that it helps you to understand the world into which these texts, Ephesians and Colossians, would have spoken, and how they would have resonated in the ears, hearts, minds, and worlds of those who first heard them. Thanks very much.